Do you struggle to see yourself as creative, or have you ever wondered where your creativity comes from and how to maximize it? This week, I'm joined by Jacob Nordby, founder of a writing room collective and author of Blessed Are the Weird, a manifesto for creatives, and The Creative Cure, a powerful guide to reconnecting with your creative self. In this week's episode, Jacob and I dive deep into the healing power of creativity, trauma, and the inner wisdom we all carry within us. Grab your pen, open your heart, and join us as we discuss how to nurture your creative intuition, how to overcome the obstacles of comparison and fear, and how creativity can make you feel more alive and help you reclaim your authentic self. Let's dive in. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, a podcast for writers who want to create stories that change lives, especially their own. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison. As a writer and trauma-informed writing coach, I'm here to guide you on a transformative journey through the art of writing, self-discovery, and resilience. Each week, I'll share my best tricks, tips, and strategies to help you write more authentically, craft deeper, truer stories, and overcome the common storytelling roadblocks we all face. Together, we'll explore how to bounce back when life gets tough and stay connected to your inner calling. So grab your pen, your notebook, and an open heart. It's time to do the work that changes the world, one story at a time. Hi, I'm Lisa Cooper Ellison, and I am excited to invite you to join me on March 5th for my course, Memoir Backstory. If you're a memoirist, you know that backstory is a crucial part of your memoir, but it can be so tricky to figure out how much to include and how to weave it in without overwhelming your story. In this webinar hosted by Jane Friedman, you'll discover what to keep, what to cut, and what to repurpose so that you can write a captivating story while also working on your author platform. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. To register, go to janefriedman.com/memoir backstory with Lisa Cooper Ellison or click on the link in the show notes. I look forward to seeing you on March 5th. Well, hello, Jacob. Welcome to the podcast. I am delighted to have you on today.
I'm so glad to be here, Lisa. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, as soon as I read the title for your book, The Creative Cure, I knew that you would be a fantastic guest. And of course, then I found out that you know one of my heroes, Julia Cameron. So that also interested me. And then when I started reading your work, I learned you are of my tribe, which also interested me. So I always like to give people a chance when we begin this conversation to let us know a little about you. So what would you like us to know about your book, about your experiences, about how you see creativity?
I would love to start there because I feel like it's so central to this entire talk, the how do I see creativity?
Yeah.
And that is, Lisa, that I actually wrote The Creative Cure as a follow-on to a book previous called Blessed Are the Weird, a Manifesto for Creatives. And what I discovered was so many people, more people than I expected, raised their hand and said, oh, yes, I'm one of those folks. But there were so many others who would come to me and they'd have this wistful look in their eye and they'd say, I'm just not that creative, or I don't have a creative bone in my body. And that began this real deep search for me because I'd been writing drafts of The Creative Cure and I just didn't feel like I was getting where I wanted to go with it. I began to realize that we way too often in the modern world have defined creativity as a product. It's an expression. So it's the book or it's the thing. And I love to move that back all the way back to, as Parker Palmer would say, I want to start with the who, because to me, creativity is our essential life force energy, and it's meant to flow through every part of our lives, just like blood does in our veins or sap does in a tree. If it's not flowing to an area, that area begins to get sick and die. So that's, I feel like, such a crucial thing to start with. Is I see so many creatives, so many people show up to me and they just feel tortured that their work isn't going to be good enough, that it won't come out right, all the things. I'm sure you hear this too. And when we go, can we just take a breath and step back from the product of this and remember this is remembering ourselves back alive. It's bringing ourselves back into connection with who we really are.
Oh, I love that. Remembering ourselves back to being alive. That's such a wonderful way to put it. And that is a lot of what I do. when I'm working with people. In fact, I was on a panel last night, and one of the things we were talking about was inspiration or, reasons why we write. And so I work with writers, which is just one form of creativity. There's so many forms, and that's what I love about your book is you talk about this more expansively. But that just happens to be the modality that I work with. And the question I get asked a lot is it good enough? And then of course, is it good enough for what or who? And what I always tell people is if you want to have a sustainable creative life, whatever that is for you, really look at yourself. How is this going to transform me in some way? Just engaging in this. And if you allow that to be the driving force, it doesn't matter if it meets some metric that the outside world says is, what you're supposed to do. Your work is always going to be successful because it's always going to be meaningful to you.
Right. Yes, Lisa. I love that you work with how we gaslight ourselves, the toxin of comparison, and all of those things. I was listening to a program with David Foster Wallace last night, and, he's one of these writers who is difficult, but also I find admirable because he was willing to break so many rules and have it work. And so I'm listening to him just kind of riff as he does, both in writing and in verbally. And I started to compare myself to that, like, oh my God,
Mm.
how fluid, how articulate, how outside the lines he is. And then I just kept needing to remember, well, that goes to my deep understanding of transformation, Lisa, which is in our modern world, most of us tend to find a guru or a model, somebody to look up to. And then if we can trim our behavior and what we do to follow them, then we'll become like them, which is worthy, which is successful, which is all these things. As I see transformation, it is much closer to nature, which is every acorn holds in it the code of the oak tree it's meant to become. It's not meant to become a pine tree. A caterpillar never transforms to become an eagle. It becomes a butterfly, right? So to me, that helps us, if we're willing to do that work and pay attention to it, it helps us remember, I'm not meant to become someone else, like some other writer. I'm meant to become who I am.
Yeah, I think of that famous quote, and now as we're talking, my mind is going blank on the name. But, the idea of keeping your channel open, that it's not your business. If it's good enough, if it's received well, it's just your business to do the work. And I had a client recently that is at the very end. Like her book is so good. I mean, I just absolutely love this work. And it's a joy. It doesn't matter to me if it's meeting that metric or not. I care that you are doing it and that you are becoming your most authentic self. And it is a joy when things are working well. And then there was this slight snag. And then I saw the panic in her face of like, oh my gosh, there's this thing and it feels insurmountable and I can't do it. And the advice that I gave to her is I said, everything is inside you. It's all there perfectly. All you have to do is get quiet enough to listen. So I said, go for a walk, put your headphones in, get out your memos app, just push play. And then I want you to just talk to yourself. Invite your highest self in, that wise part of you that knows, and then talk through the answer because it's there.
I love that so much. And I see how much of your work is trauma informed. I love that. And it's so crucial, I feel, because most people walking around the world are to some degree traumatized. And I feel that writers, people who have the desire to write, most of us are at least highly sensitive, if not deeply empathic. I feel like that's part of what we show up with that makes us able to feel and see and express, but also it makes it likely that we'll even more deeply experience some of those traumas and be affected by them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was one of the things that I liked about your book is you have this nice trifecta of things that shut us down: rejection, trauma, and socialization. And I was really thinking about how does all of that show up in my clients and myself because I'm a creative person too. And what I find is sometimes it's easy to access my creativity and sometimes it's not, depending on what's going on out in the world or what's going on inside me. And so I think it's okay for all of us to admit that, yeah, this is just what it's like. And it's about having those tools to figure out, okay, here's where I am. what do I need to do to get back to that more authentic place, to that more regulated place? Like, that's what I do a lot with trauma. Like, people are always asking me, what does it mean to be a trauma informed, writing coach? I'm like, I understand what trauma is. I understand how it impacts our creativity, and I know how to help people regulate themselves. Because, like you were saying, so many of us have experienced something traumatic, and then the world we live in is out of sync with who we are, right? And especially just social media, all of the things that we are exposed to keep us in this jacked up fight or flight state all the time. Our nervous systems are just on edge, even if you're not dealing with trauma.
Yeah, I think one of the definitions of trauma that helped me the most, because I see a lot of people being reluctant to accept the label of I'm a trauma survivor, right?
Hmm.
Because there's this whole capital T headline trauma, well, my story doesn't belong on CSI or anything like that. So this definition helped me so much, which is the simplest definition of trauma is that the event has the quality of feeling inescapable.
Yeah.
Right. Many people who work with me will take the ACEs assessment, and they'll go, look, I have a 0 or a 1. Most people have more than that they're aware of. But I've seen so many people downplay, diminish what they've experienced. And I will share with them what I had to learn for myself, which is when I look back at events through the mind of an adult that has been conditioned and has been able to put things in its places, I'm often tempted to say, well, that wasn't a big deal. Everybody experiences that. But here's the thing. If that event colored the entire sky of your imagination and experience as a child, for example, it's not just childhood experiences, but if it did, it doesn't matter if it hits the ACEs assessment. That was traumatic. It likely left, you will likely internalize some kind of message. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I talk about for a lot of people that it's a very personal thing. So, what might seem traumatic to one person might be no big deal to someone else based on prior history, based on just how you're wired. If your nervous system is sensitive, and most people who are creative have a sensitive nervous system, that sensitivity is what makes us creative because we experience the world in deep ways. And that's a wonderful gift. And it's something that it can easily be harmed by the world or overwhelmed. And what I often talk about with trauma is that when something is traumatic, I love that you said it was inescapable, because that is absolutely the case. And it's an experience of too much, right? It overwhelms the system. And because the system is overwhelmed, it goes into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn state to protect itself.
I love that now you've touched on an area that has really consumed me. In fact, I wanted more of this to go in the creative cure. I'm working on a new book where more of the actual research and neuroscience and all of that, ventral vagal theory or polyvagal theory, will show up there because I feel like it's so important. But in most of my workshops, I will show the polyvagal chart and show folks how most of us are up on that arousal curve, up into fight or flight, up into anxiety. And if we pop over into freeze, I have a dear friend who's a EMDR specialist, and he talks about walking people out of freeze.
Yeah.
You can't just help them drop directly from freeze, which is that true shutdown state, down into that lovely ventral vagal state where we're open and feeling safe and connected and all of that. I call that the creative green zone, the ventral vagal state. But he said we can't walk people through the upper ranges of fight or flight and fawn without them re-experiencing the fear that pushed them into freeze.
Yes.
And he said that's why it is such a gentle, delicate process, and we have to move back across the line often until they feel safe enough to, and often need a guide such as yourself, like, here, let me hold your hand so you know it's safe to feel these things and there's a better place to be and we can get there.
Yeah, and I talk with writers a lot about how when you're writing and you are engaging in whatever your story is in a creative way, and you're engaging that memory, you are reliving it at the nervous system level in some way. And so, something that happens, I think, when we get really product driven, like, I want to hold a book in my hand, I want to get this thing done, I want to have whatever success that I'm hoping to have, we push ourselves, and we
Yeah.
can only go as fast as the most fearful part of us can go. And when we push past that point, we tend to re traumatize ourselves, because trauma generally happens when something happens that we either don't want or we don't get what we do want and we don't have a choice, right? And there's some sort of force involved. And so when you're forcing yourself to do something that this scared part of you doesn't want to do, you are likely, recreating or reenacting what happened to you. And so your creativity is more likely to say, peace out, I'm done.
I love what you said, and I'm not going to say it, but I'd love to hear it again because I feel like it's meme worthy. We can only go as fast as the what was that you said? Go as
The
fast
most
as the
fearful part of us can go.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and being able to cherish that is so important. And one of the things that I do, and this was one of the pieces where I was like, oh, I love how we're on the same page and I really want to talk about this, is the idea of intuition and how you can build, I call it creative intuition. There's intuition in all parts of our lives, but really, how do you build that creative intuition so that you give yourself choices and so that you're directed in a way that enhances your creativity, moves you into a more expansive state versus putting yourself in situations that close you down.
Yes. Well, I have a relatively long story, but I can keep it shorter if you're interested in hearing how that really began to open up for me.
I would love that.
Okay. So I had lost everything, Lisa. By that I mean I had built businesses. I was 34, 35. Everyone, around me was reflecting, you're so successful. I was waking up terrified every morning at 3 a.m. and it didn't make sense. I had all the things, and I had a pretty massive spiritual experience in 2007 where I went to what was I thought was a meditation retreat. It turned out to be a shamanic initiation, and I had never tried any plant medicines or anything. So this was a very big deal. And it really did create that, what they call in the recovery movements, a moment of clarity. And I experienced a few moments of not being afraid and of being in contact with the universe in a way that my religious upbringing said was impossible, which meant there was no fear there. I came down out of that experience knowing everything had to change, but I didn't have any idea how to do that. And so the financial meltdown of 2008 came along and wiped all of that out. And it gave me the opportunity, painful and scary, but it gave me the opportunity to start back over. So I moved my then wife and 3 little kids to Austin, Texas, from where I live in Boise. And when I was there, I began reading The Artist's Way. So that was kind of this early thing. I'm looking at my copy of it right now. My dad's signature is on the back of it. He handed me this book before I left and said, I feel like you need to read this book. It'll help you. He said, someday I want it back. I never got the opportunity to give it back to him because he died a couple of years later. But I feel that in some ways, my ability to work with Julia Cameron and share this work with others has become part of my giving it back to him. But while I was there, there was this cigar lounge, and there was this guy who was there, such an unlikely divine messenger, squat dude, kind of a womanizer, kind of rough around the edges, but he also knew a lot about psychology. And so I would sit there and I was pouring out my story, and he was so kind to listen. And over and over again, he would ask questions and I would tell parts of the story. I didn't understand then how crucial telling the story was to healing,
Mm-hmm.
But this is where I'm getting to the intuition part, Lisa. He said, hey, I just met a young guy who moved here and he's really confused. He's really having a hard time. And he's like, I know you've been through a lot of things and I feel like you have some wisdom to share. Would you mind writing him a letter? And I'll pass it along and maybe he'll get in contact with you sometime. But I just know you can encourage him. And so, of course, I lit up like, oh, I'd love to help. Before the conversation ended, he let the cat out of the bag, which was he was asking me to write a letter to myself. And I didn't dismiss it, though, because of the fact that I learned the trick. I really realized, oh, this is likely to help. So I began writing letters from Jacob, who is my own self that I'm aware of. And I used Austin, my middle name, as the other person. So I began writing these letters to Austin, and I would just pour out my heart and my pain and confusion and fear and all the things. And then Austin would write back, sometimes the next day. And this began to be this correspondence back and forth between these parts. And I began to experience Austin as this tremendously wise and also so compassionate. There was never any shaming or anything like that, reproach. It was always very kind and helpful. Feeling a little emotional right now, even thinking about that exchange. And over time, the pain that I was expressing began to diminish, and I began to notice the voices started to sound the same. And that was when I began to experience this truth, which was always a concept before, Lisa, that all the wisdom that we really need, and you said this earlier, it's within.
Yeah.
And then all these years later, 15 or so years later, or more now, wow, writing is a daily practice, morning pages, and I've adapted it a bit to become more of a conversation. I used Writing Down Your Soul by Janet Connors as part
Mhm.
of that process, but it becomes this conversation with inner parts and the universe. And I'm always astonished to discover how clear and practical and compassionate the guidance I get back from these kinds of conversations are. And I do it every day because it's a lifeline. So I would say that's part of how I began to learn to trust that the information, the wisdom I needed was within. And then, of course, over time, being led into my own trauma work, I began to learn how we cut off our intuition, we cut
Yeah.
off our senses, and how we communicate with ourselves and listen to ourselves because of traumatic experiences and conditioning.
Mhm. First, thank you for sharing that story. Second, I'm really sorry about your dad. So I just want to honor that. And I love
Mm.
that you have that book with his signature in it and that is a part of just your growth journey. And, I write letters to myself as well. I have a whole ceremony that happens at the beginning of the year. I mean, I do it at different times. You're inspiring me to do it even more. But I always write this from my highest self. And in the beginning, it felt really hokey, like, what is this? I mean, I've been doing it for a long time, so now it's not. But what I love that you did is you created this external character that you could talk to, right? So there was Austin who could write back. And that's such a practical way to do that. I think it's Seeking Wisdom by Julia Cameron. She talks about doing this kind of work in morning pages, but that you are really talking to your higher power or your higher source. She just uses different language. But the idea of an Austin, we all need one. And that's just such a great way to do it because the wisdom is there, but we have to find ways to get access to it. And I love that you're doing that in morning pages. And I'm constantly exploring with people how else can you find that in your life and be willing to see the signs for where you're supposed to go and listen to that internal wisdom, which often is so somatic.
Yes, the somatic part I feel like is something we're so uncomfortable with in our culture.
Mhm.
We tend to be very left brain oriented and intellect heavy, and we are not listening to our interoception most of the time.
Right. Yeah, we don't. And I think if you have, traumatic experiences, and I'll just speak from my own experience, I've talked about this in the past and I think I'm changing the way that I talk about it. I was talking with one of my recent guests, Natalie Buster, about the I am, right? And so
Mm,
when you say I am, you are really defining and claiming something. And
yeah.
that is really important to do. But you want to watch how you're using your language so that you're not necessarily claiming things that may not serve you long term, right? And so I have a diagnosis of complex PTSD, and it's been helpful to understand what that is and how I can care for myself, right? So it's useful as a diagnosis, but saying I am a trauma survivor, that connects me so much to the trauma, which is just a piece of who I am, right? And it's also a piece that's in recovery. And I've been in trauma recovery for a long time. So I
Yeah.
am a person recovering from complex PTSD. And that is the truth. But what happened when I was young, because I had parents who also had complex PTSD, intergenerational trauma, this stuff happens, they could not allow me to have my preferences or to have my experience because they were so dysregulated. So my dysregulation, whatever that was, whether I was anxious or afraid or angry, or just even if I wanted something that was counter to what they wanted, they couldn't allow it. It just was not possible for them. So they would tell me my experience was not real. You're making this up, you're over dramatizing, you're selfish. Why would you want that? All of those things. And when that happens to people, and I'll say when it happened to me, it made me distrust my preferences, my understanding of my own experience. And it shut down my intuition for a really long time. And I think part of my recovery process has been recovering that piece of myself.
How did you do that? I'm sure it's many ways, but how are some of the ways you've been able to recover that piece?
Such a good question. Yeah, I think mindfulness was one piece of the puzzle. I talk about that just simply as being aware of the present moment without judgment. Like, how am I feeling? Being in my body. So, a lot of somatic work, because another thing that can happen when you're a trauma survivor is you live in, from the neck up or not even in the body at all. And so, really being able to say, okay, when am I tired? When am I feeling fear in my body or stress or anything else? That has been really helpful. 12-step recovery and using it as a framework to understand higher power and how that works in my own life has also been helpful. And energy work. And I mean, the list could go on, but I think the more I have been able to understand what's going on in my body and what my preferences are, the more I've been able to connect with just what is my yes and my no. And I'll tell you about something I'm doing right now, just very quickly, is human design. I had got my human design report, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it has been so helpful because I am a very sacral person, right? Sacral chakra is your second chakra. It is all about creativity and intuition. And that is where my yes and no exists. So all day long, I'm like, what's my yes and no? How can I connect with that part of my body? And just using it as this like gentle, recurring practice.
Mhm.
And that has been really helpful. So I'm curious to know what's worked for you.
Well, before I answer that, I'm curious, what's your main type in human design?
I am a generator.
I am too, with the sacral authority. So I feel like that segues really well into the question, the answer. You talked about feeling cut off from even knowing
Yeah.
what you would prefer or what your will was, yes or no. I experienced a lot of that too as a child, oldest of six. And I got the message very early. I don't think it was ever explicit, but definitely picked up on it. My needs don't matter. It's important that we take care of these others. And also, very authoritarian experience of being parented. And so, yeah, I was constantly being told to ignore what I wanted, what I knew to be true, what felt right, all those things. And so I think there's a long process of even beginning to reconnect with what is true there.
Hmm. Well, how have you reconnected with your intuition and understanding that part of yourself?
Well, yeah, very much in line with what we've been talking about, even making space to ask the question of how do I feel right now? What do I need right now? Those two things. How do I feel right now? And be honest about it. I found myself often masking even to myself, even in the safety of my own journal pages, I would mask. I would try to present a shinier, more okay image than I was feeling. And
Yeah.
I began to realize the foolishness of that. It's like, this is the safest place to say what you really feel, what you really need. And so I began to do that, and using some of the methods you've talked about, using I statements rather than pushing it out here, but also learning how to create a bit of separation between the identification with what I was feeling. I am feeling this way. I am
Mhm.
not angry right now. I'm feeling anger. It's an
Yeah.
experience. It's like the weather. Then I can be curious about it because, psychologists will tell us that remaining consistent with our own identity is one of the most powerful forces in the human psyche. And so the more that I claim a thing as my own, unconsciously most of the time, I'm this, I'm that, it becomes part of the identity, and it becomes very difficult to move away from those behaviors that have created that experience.
Yeah, we must be careful what we identify with. And I would love it if you would share that journaling exercise that you have, because I think, most of the people who are listening are writers. They are connecting with their creativity through that. And also, I think, through their intuition through writing. I think that can be such a profound way to use whatever that vehicle is that already feels comfortable to access this. So tell us this exercise.
Okay. I have a free program that your folks are free to take that I'll mention later. But basically it's a very simple set of three questions. Number one is, how do I feel right now?
Hmm.
And I'll come back to that in a moment. What do I need right now?
Hmm.
And then the third one is, what would I love to create? But if I'm going through a lot of difficulty or emotional turmoil or something, often I'll need to ask it differently because, putting something way out there on the horizon of, I would love to create this, can feel irrelevant at the moment. So I'll often ask in the middle of something like that, how would I love to feel right now? Yeah. And so if you go back to the first question, we've been talking about this, Lisa, but asking that question, How do I feel right now? And letting that come
Mhm.
out honestly. I'm feeling tired. I didn't get enough sleep last night. I'm feeling afraid about this interview I'm having later today, whatever it might be. It sends a signal to our inner self, to our inner creative self, and it says, I matter. I'm paying attention. I'm listening to you. And the second question is the same. What do I need right now?
Yeah.
I've been surprised at how practical those answers often are. Oh, I need to pee. I need to take a nap. Oh, I'm feeling thirsty, right? And it's surprising when you ask, like, how do we take these steps back? How do we heal that connection to our inner creative selves and our intuition? It's simpler and more practical often than we think it is. It's like if we can invite ourselves back into our body, back, as you said earlier, back into this present moment, look where our feet are planted on the ground, tell ourselves the truth of what's right now, and then ask the question, which tiny step do I need to take in the direction of what I would love?
Yeah.
Then it feels okay. It feels less overwhelming. It feels possible. Whereas if we're just sitting down, let's use in the writing world, like I'm sitting here sweating over writing a bestseller. And it's like, well, that's way out there in the future and may not ever happen in the way that my mind has it painted. Maybe I don't even care about it happening in that way. So the more that we can come back into ourselves, I feel like every time we do this with whatever it is, whether it's taking a walk, as you mentioned earlier, and listening to ourselves in that way, many, many ways of doing this, sitting meditation, all these things. Every time we do something like that, Lisa, I feel that we repair the connection to our inner creative selves that often
Yes.
gets filled with static and with pain and with all the things that keep us from listening.
Yeah. Giving yourself what you need is so essential. And we talk about in the therapy world, you may have heard this term, the corrective emotional experience, which usually happens with another person where they mirror or they give you this thing that you didn't have in the past. But I think we can do this in these like very small, simple ways by when we have a need or an urge, we offer it to ourselves. We're like, oh, yeah, I need to pee. I'm going to get up and go to the bathroom, or I'm thirsty. I'm going to get a drink. Just that simple piece of telling your body, telling your creative self, I am listening. Those simple things allow you to connect with the things that may feel more ethereal. Where I am with my intuition is that I will get these nudges. Usually it happens in my gut, my lower gut near my sacral chakra, which is interesting. And I'll have like a burning, a heat, or a tension that will say, do this thing. And sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's urgent. The more I can just pay attention and go, oh, it's there, and then I do it, I find the easier my life is. And also the more creative I am. And some of the publications I've had that I'm most proud of, these essays have come from like this internal, like, write this, do this thing. I listen and then it's like, oh, yeah, it goes very smoothly. Whereas other things, I'm like, oh, let me think about it from up here and figure out the thing. And sometimes that works out and, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a different process.
Right. Agreed. We often make the mistake of creating a mental concept of what we think a creative person is and then try to get into that bubble out here somewhere. And often it has little to do with reality. And what I've learned about our creative energy, if we go back to this is the spark of life, if your listeners want to put their hand over their heart right now and just wait till they can feel their heart beating, it's the spark, right? It's that electricity
Hmm.
that keeps our hearts beating. It makes galaxies spin. So therefore, it's primal, it's primitive, it's sensual, it's connected to the earth, it's connected to actual life. It's not as ethereal as we often make it. I have a dear friend who's a neuropsychologist, and when I was writing this book, he and I were having conversations about left brain, right brain, and all that. And I got excited. I said, well, Chris, it sounds like what you're saying. It's almost like we've told a bodybuilder to only develop the muscles on the left side of their bodies, like totally disregard the right side. Don't even look at that. This is the only thing that's important. And then after 20 or 30 years of doing that or more, that person discovers they can barely walk down the street. They're not functional.
Yeah.
And his face lit up. He's like, oh my God, yes, exactly. That's exactly what we've done. So it's not a matter of disregarding the left brain or the way that we process information and make meaning of it. It's simply a matter of going, we have cut ourselves off from tremendous wellspring of originality and intuition
Yeah.
and perception and experience. And so many of the things that I'm sure that you work with people in ways that sometimes feel uncomfortable, and I do too. And I try to make that as gentle and as safe as possible. But it's also
Mhm.
like, imagine you've been sitting on your foot for the last 40 years and then you stand up. You're probably going to fall down. It's going to feel
Right.
awkward. You're going to feel dumb. It might be even painful. So let's just go slowly and gently, but let's begin to bring circulation back to these other parts.
That's such a great metaphor. Also, as a person who has practiced Buddhism for a very long time and done a lot of sitting meditation where my foot has gone to sleep, it feels very apt.
Well, and it's funny because we can so easily understand that with that kind of an image. Yes, of course, we've all sat somewhere and then stood up and almost fallen over, or
Right.
or the foot was tingly and awkward. We felt dumb. What we forget is, as we begin to restore the connection to our inner creative selves, and this I feel is important, Lisa, is for everyone to remember your inner creative self has always been there. And by the way, it can't be damaged, it can't be diminished. It's always there. What can happen and what does happen is we create this persona so that we can navigate the world that's known as our ego. And that becomes who we think we are. And often that connection between who we really are and who we think we are, who we've been using to survive and cope, that connection can get really, really frayed, and there can be almost no signal coming between. So everything we're talking about today is really about healing that connection, because the inner creative self, that inner genius that Plato talks about, it's alive and well in every single person who's listening to this.
And the whole goal is to just reconnect and re-enliven it, not bring it to life, but re-enliven it because, yeah, it is already there and you just have to reconnect with it. Well, you mentioned just a few minutes ago, Jacob, that you have a program that people might be interested in. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, yes, and I kind of let the cat out of the bag with those three questions. That is essentially what it is. But they can go to creativeselfjournal.com, and that will allow them to look at what the program's all about. There's an ebook, I think it's 14 pages long, and I did an audio version of it. I also did a 3 or 4 minute instructional video just to help people understand why this process, why we're doing this. And then I also offer a guided visualization to really help people just begin to reactivate their imagination in creating a scene that feels peaceful and calming, and bring them down into that green zone. So I love giving this away. When I first wrote it years ago, it was because I was participating in a program and I didn't think it was, speaking of gaslighting our own creativity, Lisa, I didn't think it was worth anything. It came out very quickly. It felt so basic. And then when I put it out there, at first hundreds and then thousands, and over time, just so many people have experienced. And I've had therapists I don't know write me and say, this is helping clients who have never been willing to journal actually try it.
Nice.
So it's one of those experiences I've had of creating something that has been valuable, and I didn't think it was probably worth much. So it makes my heart happy to know that I can share it with people.
Well, I can say, Jacob, from reading your book, meeting with you today, and just looking at all of the things that you do online, your work is very valuable.
Thank you.
Oh, and I really appreciate the chance to have spent time with it and to spend time with you. And I know that other people are going to be interested in it. It's going to speak to them. So if people want to connect with you, you've already given us one link. Are there any other links, like if someone wants to connect with you on social media or any other way, what are the best ways for people to connect with you?
They could probably visit my jacobnordby.com is probably a good, simple way to do it. They'll find a lot of this stuff there, and also links to social media. I made a decision probably 5 or 6 years ago not to try to build the biggest social media accounts. So people who show up to my stuff are gonna, are are gonna just get what I like to share that day,
Mhm.
not because I'm necessarily trying to grow an audience to the maximum size. So I love people who hang out with me there, because it's like, you chose to be here because you are interested in some of the same things I am.
I love that. And, I think that we can spend so much time trying to become an, I don't know, social media celebrity influencer, come up with the next word you want to, that it can actually really take away from our lives because so much of it is an illusion. And also, it just creates these unhealthy dopamine hits that they actually take away from your creativity and your joy, which that could be a whole other conversation we could have. So I might have you back another time to talk about that because there's so many things we could talk about. But I do want to let people know if they want to connect with you on social media, All of your links are in the show notes, so it should be very easy for people to connect. And I hope that they do. And I look forward to staying in touch with you because one of my heroes, and you do such great work in the world. So thank you so much, Jacob, for being on the show.
Oh, what a pleasure. It's really been great to speak with you today.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Jacob Nordby. If you'd like to learn more about Jacob and, most importantly, buy a copy of The Creative Cure, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, please text the podcast if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or post a comment on YouTube with a name you'll use when writing letters from the wisest part of yourself. You share yours, and I will share mine too. And speaking of comments, I want to thank Tina Sweet and Karen DeBonis for your recent comments and questions about embracing the full catastrophe with Casey Mulligan Walsh. It was clear that you listened to this carefully, and I was deeply appreciative to hear from you. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe or follow Writing Your Resilience on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review to help others discover the podcast. 3, join my engaged writing community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, a toolkit for gaslight-proofing your writing practice. Have feedback for the show, a topic you'd love me to cover, or questions you'd like me to answer? Drop a comment on YouTube, text the show, or email me at writingyourresiliencepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, keep writing, keep growing, and keep showing up for yourself. Your story matters, and I am so proud to be writing alongside you.